Now I make some pretty bold claims in this channel. Saying that World War III is going to start in about 5 years, I think that qualifies as a pretty bold claim. But I'm not making these off the top of my head. I'm not a doomsday prophet. Rather, this is based upon some very solid theory and a number of obvious social trends that are happening right now. So what I'd like to do with this video is explain to you where I'm coming from. Give you the information, because once you have the basic facts, the basic theory, it's pretty obvious what's going on in the world right now. So, with that in mind, buckle in, you're in for a long trip. Let's start with the basics. History is a science. See, a lot of people, historians included, nowadays, don't know what history fundamentally is. They mistake it for storytelling, as if stories are only about telling stories. They mistake it for propaganda supporting the present regime. But see, everything that one does in life ought to be about truth-seeking. And the scientific method is often a very, very good method for seeking out the truth. And that's exactly what history employs. Hypothesis, experiment, conclusion. Any good historian does this all the time. A valid theory of history should be predictive. It should not only predict the future to a certain extent, it should predict the past. And in fact, with the theory I'm about to tell you, if I told the guys that came up with it 15 years ago that one popular TV show in 2012, 2013 was based upon the War of the Roses, I mean, of course, Game of Thrones, that the CBC had a series based upon the Tudors, and that another extremely popular series was The Walking Dead, they would not be the least bit surprised. This is exactly where we fit into history. And to go back to the Doomsday Prophet, let me ask you something. How well received would a Doomsday Prophet in 1935 be? He'd be pretty well received. Contrast to 1969. Summer O' Love. They'd blow him off. So just the fact that doomsday profiting is such a popular thing to do nowadays is yet more evidence of where we are in history. Now, the men in question are Strauss and Howe in their book The Fourth Turning. That they identified 4 major parts, 4 major cycles that societies go through. The sine wave of history, the seculum, they call it, from the old Roman word, recognizing the exact same pattern. What it boils down to is that there's 4 ages of man. A man goes through 4 points in his life. Childhood, from 20 to 40, he has his young adulthood where he establishes himself. 40 to 60, he has the age where he becomes an expert in his field, a leading force in the world. And then 60 to 80, he becomes a wizened elder. This has been true since time immemorial. The average life expectancy, when you take out the medicine, people still live to 85. 100 years, 200, 300. Not as many, but people still live to 85. And so because of this 4-part life cycle, you wind up getting a 4-part cycle in history. So let's go through these one by one. The first part of the seculum, high summer, if you want, is the high. It is the period. Think about Romulus and Remus after winning their wives and establishing Rome. Think about Charlemagne after Roland died and they defeated the Saracen hordes, establishing the French, the beginning of France, the beginning of Europe. Think about World War II. Coming home and establishing the Great Society. This is the high. This is the point where society has fought its battles, it's earned its place, it is now official, we're going to do what we want now. We've earned it. Following the high, you get the awakening. The awakening is a spiritual experience. It's the recognition that the high wasn't enough, that the high was good. We had stable material wealth, we were healthy, but now what are we supposed to do with ourselves? Yeah, this is when new religions are formed. This is when churches split. This is the 60s. Following the awakening, you get an unraveling. A consequence of the awakening, of this overthrowing of the old norms, is that things start to fall apart from the very ground up. The great unraveling when people are directionless in society. And finally, following the unraveling, you have the crisis. And then following the crisis, you have the next high. Strauss and Howe actually identified 7 distinct periods since the 1500s that fit this pattern. And they cite Roman scholars that talk about this pattern. And they cite other economic analysts, other historians that never quite explored it as thoroughly as they did, but discovered a very, very similar pattern. So, just give you a quick run through of the other 7. The first was the late medieval in 1435. The next one was the Reformation in 1487. Next, the exploration of the New World in 1594. The Revolutionary Era in 1704. The Civil War era in 1794, the Great Power era in 1865, and finally, the Millennial era, starting in 1946 with the victory in World War II, predicted to end approximately some point between 2022 and 2026, somewhere around there. And they also point out that every single one of these seculums has ended with total war. So, to go a bit more into this, where should I start? Let's do the 4 generations that appear. Now let's start with the GI generation, because we all know the GI generation. These are the heroes that are born, the heroes that won World War II, that became the leaders during the 50s, that organized this great society. They are extremely disciplined. They work together as a team. They tend to be a little bit black-white in their thinking, and they organize well. They want leadership. This is also the same group that formed the Hitler Youth, incidentally. Following the hero generation, you have the artist generation. These are the ones you don't notice. These are the ones that, in the 1960s, were doing what they were supposed to. They were overprotected as children, and they just live life the way they're supposed to. They're very compassionate. They're not extremely active. They're the middle ground between the extremely obedient hero generation and the prophet generation that comes next. The prophet generation, who are raised by the hero generation, remember? So you have the hero parents, and you have in the middle, in their 20s, 30s, you have the artist generation establishing themselves as young adults. The children coming out are from the hero generation. So as the hero generation gets older, after winning their wars, winning their battles, they're extremely stiff upper lip. They're extremely square. And so you get the prophet generation reacting against the heroes and demanding new spiritual realities. The 60s. And then what you get next, the nomad generation. The generation, while the artists were overprotected as children, the nomads are underprotected. The nomads grow up in a broken society. Think cowboys. Think the Ronin, the errant knight. These are the nomads, disaffected and considered uncultured by their elders. They're thrown into a world without any society to support them. This is Generation X. And then following the nomads, you get another hero generation, which is going to be a major focus later on in this video. So now, let's look at history. You've got the basic principles right now. So you have the four eras. You have the high, you have the high, you have the awakening, you have the unraveling, and then you have the crisis. Same time you have the four generations. You've got the hero generation, teamwork. You've got the artist generation, gentle, don't have a huge impact on history. Then you've got the prophet generation. They have to rediscover the spiritual world. And then you've got the nomad generation. As things are falling apart, they become strong individualists. They learn how to survive. So when you combine these two, let's look at history. Let's start with World War I. This was an unraveling period. Contrast it. We have World War I, which is a completely pointless war that accomplishes nothing, and then 40 years later, we fight World War II, which changed the world. And 40 years before that, we'd had the American Civil War, which also changed the world. And World War I, you have these young nomads going to die in the trenches from the howitzers for no reason whatsoever, for a war that accomplishes nothing. And so following that, during the rest of the 20s, they party it up. They get drunk. They're living during this unraveling time where the feminists are going nuts, the prohibitionists are going nuts, and it's just a miserable place to live. Big bankers are making a lot of money. Marketing is being developed. The old society that was created in 1865 is gone. Now we have nothing. So you go to a speakeasy. You've got the flapper girls. You know, you dance around, you get drunk, you get laid. Nothing matters. Sound familiar? Followed by the crisis. The economic system collapses in 1929. All of a sudden you've got the Dust Bowl. You've got people working on chain gangs. You've got people in this era, the young people, just want to form into organizations. This is the hero generation coming into their own at this age. Hero generation, born during World War I, born between 1908 and 1929. They're now coming into their own. They're young adults that can't find a job, that, went and got an education, nobody's hiring. Again, does this sound familiar? So they are very quick to throw their allegiance into all the work programs of the United States, to throw their allegiance with the Hitler Youth and create these fascist movements throughout Europe. And then when war finally comes, the war they've been craving this entire time, because at least it's better than the Dust Bowl, they do brilliant things. Meanwhile, their commanders are those hard sons of bitches from World War I. Patton was one of the nomads from World War I. And while all this is going on, while World War I is going on, the silent generation is being born. Overprotected. These parents during the 1930s, the few that can actually afford to have kids, overprotect their kids. You actually have a drop in the birth rate. And there's some very interesting things there about the stereotype of the Jewish lawyer actually comes from this period. Because there were so few children born during the 1930s that as those children grew up, particularly in the 50s, when there was more money and they could be properly educated, there was a glut of teachers towards the students. There was way more funding for education than was needed. And so all of these Jewish families that started off as dry cleaners, for the most part back in the 20s, wound up giving birth to a generation of lawyers. Thus, the stereotype of the Jewish lawyer that you get in the 1980s. But that aside. So, the hero generation, the GI generation that were born during the, 1910 to 1930, and they were just the right amount of parented, end up winning World War II, and we've got the Great Society. They're elders at this point. They're the ones in charge. And the silence, the artist generation, the ones that were overprotected in the 30s, just do what they're supposed to. They become a Jewish lawyer eventually. They're the women with the beehive hairdos. They're that stereotypical picture of the 1950s, the one you see in the old Folgers commercials, that's the silent generation. Actually, funny little thing. The silents, when they start out, the gender differences between the silents are huge. They start off with very strong male roles, very strong female roles, but then as they age, they tend to throw those away and become more ubiquitous. Whereas with the nomads, it's the exact opposite. So the nomads, when they're young, think about grunge, think about punk. When they're young, they tend to all dress the same. There's this rejection of gender norms. But then as the nomads get older, they start to really embrace gender norms. So, now you've got the society. The people in their 20s and 30s are just happy with the way life is. They're doing what they're supposed to, they're going to their job at the factory, they're drinking Folgers coffee, not interested in shaking the boat. At the top, you have the stiff-nosed heroes that fought this war and tend to kind of be dickhead parents. And so at the growing up now, you've got the prophet generation. You've got the children of the 60s. And they need to overthrow everything. So, now you've got the 60s. There's the Cultural Revolution all over the bloody world. All of a sudden we're experimenting with different drugs, different forms of religion. And again, this has happened throughout history. You've got the stiff-nosed, the squares running things that are slowly being pushed out of power. And behind them come the silents, who don't really fight against the hippies. The silents, they're too empathic. They just kind of go with the flow. Whatever the hippies want to do, okay, we'll allow them gradually. And then the hippies are giving birth to Generation X. They are irresponsible parents, latchkey kids, they've torn apart society, and so now Generation X is growing up in a world with no culture, no support structure. We become the Ronin wandering the earth. We're actually mostly the children of the silence. It's the silent generation in their 30s and 40s that are raising the Gen X generation. But we're being raised in a world created by the boomers. And when the boomers finally do have kids, they have the millennials, who are another hero generation, who we'll get back to in a little bit. See, that's the basic theory that they have, the 4 cycles, the 4 generations, and they've got a lot of evidence supporting it. Like I said, Tudor era, same cycle. Game of Thrones, same cycle. Tyrion Lannister is Generation X. The parents, they're all boomers. They're all idealists. And the young wolves being raised in the show, they're all millennials, heroes. They're just there to fight. But when talking about history, the thing is that there's always unprecedented events that happen. The psychohistory of Harry Seldon in the Foundation novels by Isaac Asimov, it's supposedly this mathematical formula that predicts exactly where history will go. And you can't do that. There are too many wild cards, too many unexpected things that happen. In fact, there's even been a few events that disrupted the 4-stage cycle. But the 4-stage cycle keeps happening despite events. It doesn't mean that we're locked into history. It means that we can't perfectly predict it. And see, right now, there are 4 major game changers that we need to consider when analyzing history. 4 things that have fundamentally changed the landscape that we're dealing with the very nature of society. It's easy to talk about how society is degenerating, how we're all becoming savages nowadays. Part of that's the period that we're in. We just finished the unraveling and we've just gotten into the crisis. And so it's, yeah, talking about degeneration is cool and fun and it's the vogue right now. But then there's other effects. There are technological effects that are fundamentally changing the nature of society. So let's look at these. First of all, don't blame feminists for the current sexual marketplace. Blame antibiotics. Feminists in particular are these aging baby boomer the Egyptian mummies. And they've been locked up in safe little cages. They don't really leave the ivory tower bubble. And okay, they reach out occasionally and touch a young woman taking a women's studies class, infects her with mummy rot. But they're dead, they're old, they're not influential. Fighting against feminists is, unless you're just sparring for fun, it's pretty pointless. See, what really led to the modern sexual marketplace is antibiotics. The fact that STDs are curable nowadays. Like, they're the worst thing you're going to have to do if you get an STD is have an uncomfortable diagnostic process, but you can get cured easily. So this is what allowed the culture of free sex to arise. Feminists are feminism could not have created a free sex environment without antibiotics. So if you're going to blame it on something, blame it on the antibiotics. Related to that, very much related to the antibiotics, is how thoroughly our medical technology extends life nowadays. I haven't, you know what, I don't have any major hypotheses about this, but I think it's self-evident that 200 years ago, most people didn't live to the age of 80. Nowadays, just about everybody does, and that has changed things. These sarcastic comments you hear about voters down in Florida, the old people just voting for more Medicare to have another 3 months of life at the expense of their children. And the fact that 100, 200, 300 years ago, a lot of children died after childbirth. Whereas nowadays we can keep people with the most depressing and sad genetic mutations alive for their entire lives. There was still selective pressure 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Nowadays, everybody lives to old age. It used to be that if you were an idiot, you usually died before you got to old age. That the seniors were actually pretty tough sons of bitches, people that you respected, people that you looked up to, people with some wisdom to impart. Nowadays, every idiot survives until old age, and they all vote. This, again, is having some sort of major effect on society. I'm not entirely sure what, but it's pretty obvious that there's an effect from it. What else? The internet. Well, of course, the internet. Let's talk about exactly how it's influencing things. First, there's the ubiquitous porn. We've always been a very horny species, okay? Like, there's always been lots of weird sex. Right now, we're going through a phase where the millennials are they're coming into their own, and they're reacting extremely hard against the porn, which I'll get back to. But you can't blame porn on the modern society. It's modern technology. We've always had weird porn. We've always had people with weird kinks. It's just that 100 years ago, you used to be able to separate it. You know, this is the adult section of the bookstore. This is the, you know, G-rated section. Now we're living in an era where these kids are growing up and every 12-year-old has seen a gangbang video. That is just a fact of reality. Hopefully there will be some positives and that people might actually enjoy their sex lives more, but it also desensitizes people towards sex and makes them start treating it like a bowel movement. Complex issue, easy to be reactionary against, but the universe doesn't care how reactionary you are. The internet is a fact, internet porn is a fact. It's here to stay, and it's affecting how we mate, how we form relationships with one another. The next big effect from the internet is freedom of speech. And I don't mean freedom of speech as in the fundamental French revolutionary human right. I mean freedom of speech as a social good. You see, there's a lot of things being figured out nowadays on the internet. People talking to each other across vast distances. People that have a piece of the puzzle, but not the entire thing. Getting together and putting together these pieces. During the fall of Rome, there were plenty of people that had pieces, but they couldn't communicate. They didn't even have the printing press back then. Nowadays, we can communicate globally. And this is having some very, very interesting effects. And some of these effects, I do have my hypotheses about what these are going to do. The people that can be educated are being educated in the things that actually matter nowadays. This is unprecedented. Nobody expected the internet. And again, just to go back to that generational thing again, see, this opinion that I'm advocating about the internet is very much a baby boomer, is very much a prophet type of opinion on it. Because, of course, the guys that invented the internet were from the prophet generation. Now, how are the millennials starting to look at it, the hero generation? A lot of them are beginning to see future tyranny in the internet, the constant tracking of technology. Let's rewind to cars. In the 1920s, cars were viewed as a bad thing because it would give the elites the ability to drive all over the country, while poor people were stuck using horses. 40 years later, cars are viewed as a wonderful social thing because everybody has them. And then again, 40 years later, cars start to be viewed as an elite gas guzzler thing again. That constant cycle. So we're seeing the other half of the internet, that yes, it can be used to enforce the police state. And one more effect of the internet is the globalization of certain industries. The computer programmers saw this happen to them, that their industry just got destroyed by the internet because you can go anywhere to computer program. Location independence it's not quite here yet. A few industries are feeling it. If you're a programmer, you felt it. If you've tried to do any freelance writing, you felt it. Used to be, if you go, can't recall the name, the Hunter S. Thompson movie that came out a year ago. To have a writer for a newspaper, you had to pay enough for him to live in that city. Nowadays, the bottom's dropped out because a writer can live anywhere. This is going to become more common. People commuting from home. We haven't figured out a good culture how to run it just yet. This is why Yahoo canceled their program to let people work at home. Because the people working at home were slacking off and killing the morale of the people at the office actually working. But it will come eventually. So that's the three big effects from the internet that I notice. And one more factor that we need to consider nowadays: use of weapons. The equality of weapons. That modern weapons, the invention of the gun, has fundamentally changed society. As the saying goes, you know, God made all men equal, but what is the quote? God made all men equal, but Mr. Cole, I can't remember the quote. But the gun made everybody actually equal. Everybody's equally dangerous with a gun. And we're certainly seeing that in the wars that we're fighting. Against 14-year-olds with no training are taking on a first world army. I suppose you could also toss nuclear weapons into this, but I actually don't think nuclear weapons are going to be much of an issue over the next 40 years. Which, again, I'll get to. So these are some of the game changers. Again, antibiotics affecting both sex life and affecting the survival rates of people that we might be better off if they died, quite frankly. We've got the internet with its free porn, with its free speech, and with its freedom of movement, its location independence, and we've got weapons that make us all equal, that make it much, much harder to be a totalitarian. So that said, we supposedly, according to this theory, we are in the crisis right now. The unraveling started early 80s, more or less, and it ended, let's say 2007. Housing collapse. It's a good place to put that. Same as the last unraveling ended in 1929. So we have the unraveling over with. We are thoroughly into the crisis period. What evidence is there that we're in the crisis period? Why can't this just go on forever? So, And I'm just going to break it down to like 5 big reasons why we can't keep going on the way we're going on. Proof that we're in the crisis. All right, number 1, we've got the economic situation. Mass socialism throughout the world. Again, that's the interesting thing. Probably an effect of European colonialization, but everywhere in the world is dealing with these issues. Not just the US, not just Europe, but Singapore, China, Middle East are all running into very, very similar problems. The proximate cause is sometimes different. Sometimes the drop in birth rate is not because of feminism, it's because of X, but the birth rates are dropping. There's a disconnect, there's all of these problems. So yes, socialism is the first one. Right now we are borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. This can't go on. It's a house of cards. It's going to collapse eventually. Next, okay, we've got the corporate work environment and consumerism. Our entire work lives are completely messed up. I've talked before about how the modern workplace is designed for women. It artificially feeds all of her short-term needs. It makes her feel like she's part of a tribe, she's appreciated, she's loved. But in the long term, the modern corporate workplace leads to incredible amounts of female misery. And the young kids growing up are going to see that. Auntie Jane, that spent 15 years of her life working for the company and is now embittered and alone and has cats, the millennials are noticing that. Alright, 3, the whole sexual market is completely messed up. It's completely degraded into this studs and sluts culture where you work at your stupid office job for 5 days a week, and then Friday, Saturday you go unload your genitals like they're your bowels. And it's this ugly, hate-filled environment. I think this is actually why a lot of guys want to reject game. Not because game doesn't work, but because they don't want to engage in the slut culture. Which of course you don't. You guys have souls. Missing the point that game is more than just picking up girls at clubs. But yeah, the whole relationship between men and women is broken. This cannot continue. Men and women want to be together. We were built for each other. So this artificial, hateful relationship can't last. Next, number 4 is multiculturalism. We've had multiculturalism absolutely shoved down our throats, and we are all living in these mixed societies with no proper nationalism, no proper identity, and the simple fact of the matter is that multiculturalism leads to more hatred and more aggression between people. It's eminently provable, it's been studied again and again. Fact of the matter, people like to hang out with people like them. They like to know what the social norms are in their environment. And although the occasional cat and dog can get along really well, if you shove 20 cats and 20 dogs into the same room, it's not going to last. And the 5th one, the 5th thing that can't keep going, is a celebration of the aberrant. On the one hand, far be it for me to judge somebody with an alternative lifestyle. Except back when they were introducing all these alternative lifestyles, homosexuality, transsexuality, BDSM community, etc., etc. See, when they were introducing these, back in the 70s, when these people were coming out of the closet and arguing, you know, that no, I'm not mentally ill, that I was born in the wrong body. Back then, there was a lot of abuse, there was a lot of prejudice, etc. So if these people had problems in their lives, you could write it off as an effect of bullying, as an effect of being rejected from society. Except people with, alternative lifestyles are no longer prejudiced against at all. In fact, they're quite the opposite. And yet, what are we finding? Now, certainly there's some people in the BDSM community, there's some homosexuals, some lesbians, some transsexuals that, they seem okay. But there is a huge, huge majority of these people that suffer major life problems, drug addiction, suicide, constantly in and out of therapy, that it's becoming indefensible to say that you should promote these lifestyles because most of the people in them are extremely unhealthy. So, quick recap of these 5 points. Socialism is going to crash eventually. The consumer corporatist workplace is making us miserable. Gender relations, the sex relationship is completely broken. Multiculturalism doesn't work, and celebration of non-traditional lifestyles is indefensible. Those are 5 big reasons. I'm sure you can come up with some more. But the path we're on right now, something is going to break. We're putting too much stress on the engine, and people are getting sick of it. On my last video, I commented that the left has won. That the left owns everything. They've defined reality. Let's just admit it. You've won, guys. You've won. And Joseph Shipman very insightfully pointed out that as soon as you admit that the left has won, that they're on top, that's when you can throw them off. Because the left has won. They own everything. Like every major leftist battle has been won. They're just cleaning up the scraps. And if we realize this, this is why politics is so pointless and cynical. Because the Republicans are just the other half of the Liberal Party. It's the same thing again and again and again. Until all of a sudden, it isn't. This isn't to say the liberals couldn't keep going. They've won all their victories, all of their battles, but they could keep going. They could go with their drone warfare and their constant surveillance state and their forced equality and their castration of males. You can easily see the Democrat Party creating a complete dystopia with the direction they're going. And yet, whenever you read a dystopian novel, it's always set in the 1950s, isn't it? What is it? The Bergman, the Harold Bergman, something like that. The forced equality in that one, set in the 1950s. You've got married couples at home sitting on their sofas watching television. 1984. Again, it's set in 1950. 1950 with surveillance state technology, but still 1950. You have this productive economic base under everything. This basically solid human relationships that are just beginning to be eroded in the surveillance state. Even Brave New World, the characters largely have attitudes that are 1950s. So although the liberals could keep going, although we could go into complete police state, I don't think we're going to. They're running out of juice is the problem. Without these 1950s households to get the taxes out of to fund this insane plan of theirs, it's unlikely to happen. Possible, but unlikely. And now here's where we come to the next iteration from the fourth turning, which, again, very interesting, something I've been noticing. That the political parties in the United States tend to flip positions every so often. Now, if you're older than 25, you probably remember the Liberals being the party of freedom, the party of license, what have you, the non-judgmental, do whatever you want party. Except, as all those idiots that voted for Obamacare are noticing, the Liberals are fast becoming the dictatorial party, the party of I will tell you how to live. Meanwhile, the conservatives, the Republican Party, 40 years ago, used to be the moral majority party, that we know what you should be doing with your life and you have to obey us. And yet, they're fast becoming the freedom party, aren't they? Standing up for people's right to own guns, standing up for people's not to be taxed by stupid things. They're not quite ready yet, but they're moving in the right direction. Now, let's look at the Libertarian Party. If you look at the 1930s, all of these idiotic, all of these alternative politics were really, really popular in the 1930s. The same way, over the past 5 years, the internet's been exploding with libertarians and ANCAPs and neo-Marxists and all of these alternative methods. Now, in practice, these methods never work. If you want a perfect example of that, go read Robert Heinlein's book, We the Living, which is basically a pamphlet for the social credit method of economics. And then go look up the social credit governments in Alberta. And it's hilarious how different the two are. Which is why we're now getting the reaction against the Libertarian Party. Libertarians are just these people very angry and upset, looking for an alternative lifestyle. Same thing with the Occupy Wall Street people. Angry, upset, looking for an alternative. And heck, even the Tea Party. Angry, upset, looking for an alternative. You get all of these weird movements at the beginning of the crisis. We got them in the 1930s, we have them today. But eventually they evaporate, for the most part, hopefully. So, one of my predictions is that we are going to eventually see the Republicans become the new Freedom Party. Mitt Romney was not a freedom guy. Mitt Romney's a step in the right direction, but he's not enough of a step. For a better example of how this moral majority prick can be actually on the side of freedom, look at the Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. So Stephen Harper is your typical party leader sociopath that comes from this conservative Christian background, that he knows that God wants him to ban marijuana. But what's he actually doing in Canada? He is doing an amazing job keeping us free. Thing is, he hasn't pushed any Christian laws onto the country. He's disassembled the long-arm rifle registry. He's basically maintained the status quo and left Canadians alone. And the diplomats in Canada are becoming known for telling the UN to go fly a kite. It's going to be very sudden and dramatic when it happens. And it might actually be the next election. But we'll actually see somebody leading the Republican Party who is not a bought and sold interest of the banking cartels and the corporations and all of this. It's going to be very stark and very sudden. Things are going to be thrown on their heads because this system is unsustainable, and the millennials, they're getting pissed off. Mind you, let's not talk too highly about the millennials. See, part of the hero generation is that the heroes are really seeking agreement, teamwork. They do tend towards militaristic obedience. And so right now you see FEMA has the FEMA Youth Corps, which is exactly the same as Hitler Youth, except they're in blue t-shirts, preparing to kill lots and lots of Americans. Except FEMA Youth just doesn't have the energy. As the Democrats keep pushing their policies, as things like Obamacare start bankrupting the small individual, people are going to start getting pissed off, and eventually you're going to have a Republican Party reaffirming freedom. In a lot of ways, this is going to be the end of the leftist experiment. We've gone basically as far as we can go with leftism. We have a new pope now who seems like a pretty solid right-wing guy that actually believes in his vows of poverty. Combine that with a Republican Party that can actually get its shit together and stop being in the back pockets of the bankers, we've got something interesting going on all of a sudden. But, war. Every other seculum has ended with total war. There's some reasons to think that there won't be total war this time. Not nuclear war, not Mad Max, not a giant fight with China over world domination. We can't really afford world domination anymore. Neither can China. Remember, everybody else in the world is suffering the exact same demographic problems, diversity problems, breeding problems, etc. So China, why won't we go to war with them? First of all, we are too interdependent with them. Their global trade is a very, very important thing, even in basic commodities. Oil, electricity, wood, water. These are very important trade routes, which are reasons that these countries won't want to go to war with each other. There's really, like, you go to war, you lose this fundamental resource you need, and you gain nothing. The next thing is that the conflicts going on nowadays are mostly, the conflict that are coming too are going to be internal. We don't really have external conflicts anymore. Afghanistan, Iraq, those are primarily internal conflicts with American troops as soldiers fighting them. It's between different factions within those countries that the wars are being fought, and the Americans are just on one side of that. There aren't really inter-country wars. And the other reason that we're not going to go into this total World War III Mad Max scenario is institutions persist. There's a lot of very, very established institutions that have lasted longer than you or I, longer than the last seculum. They're still going to be around. Now that said, there is going to be a major, major conflict. The social cloth holding us all together is fraying. Now, I think if you do a little bit of math, you can figure out for yourself what the conflict in the United States is going to be. I'd rather not get banned for hate speech comments on this channel. I do like making videos and getting a little bit of advertising revenue off of them. So instead of that, let's talk about Israel. Israel's going to be an ugly local conflict. And despite the rhetoric, there are a lot of Arab countries that are on the side of Israel, so long as the United States is on the side of Israel. That's the sort of conflict we're looking at. That one might go nuclear. Either Israel's going to dominate the region, or they'll be wiped out. That really is up to Israel to see how it happens. Europe, you might have some wars there as well, but I don't think they're going to go nuclear. And in China, the Southeast Asia theater is going to be its own local conflict. And the United States, again, I think it's pretty obvious what sort of conflict is coming there. And it's going to be extremely bloody and unpleasant, and painful. That's the thing, you know, during the awakening we come together, during the crisis we rip apart. And we came together so hard that the ripping apart is going to be pretty painful. But how is all this going to look when the conflict is done? Like I said, I think this is the end of the left. This is the end of the Puritans. I think they've done everything, and they've messed up the world. They've made things ugly now. I think that it's really going to put the nail into their coffin. They'll still be around in a few ways, but they're going to be defanged at this point. What I think it's going to look like is the collapse of Rome minus the 400-year Dark Age. See, Rome didn't collapse immediately, it collapsed gradually. It wasn't an overnight thing. You can draw, like, when, you know, the barbarians sacked it, you can put that as a line, but Rome didn't disappear when the barbarians sacked it. Rome is still here today. But the Roman Empire, it's an arbitrary line in the sand for when it ended. And so I think this is going to be an arbitrary line in the sand for when Pax Americana, the Puritans' Pax, ended. Except we're not going to go into this massive, massive decline until we have another Charlemagne. At least I hope we won't. What we're going to see, first of all, is people retreating to ethnic enclaves. You see, people, again, we have so much multiculturalism that the reaction is going to be very strongly against it. People are going to retreat to nationalist or ethnic enclaves, or sometimes a little bit of both. People that are in communities where they are not part of the ethnicity are going to be very, very eager to prove that they're part of the ethnicity. Brown guys wearing cowboy hats in Calgary. You're going to have this strong reaffirming as the hero generation, after fighting this conflict, they establish society. It's going to be very moralistic, very strong, and there's very distinct possibility it could be right-wing. So each area is going to have kind of its own thing going on, but it's going to be retreating back to the city-states that happened after Rome. In some cases, countries, in some cases, regions. But people are going to retreat to a very, very strong sense of self-identity. The United States, the federal government will probably survive, but it's actually going to become the United States once more, with probably 5 or 7 major regions that it's broken into. But while people retreat to their ethnic enclaves, we're not going to go into a dark age because, again, the ubiquity of trade. Alberta is making a lot of money selling oil from the oil sands. They're not going to want to let that go. And China certainly will keep wanting our oil. The United States will want our oil. So while socially we're going to be constricting, again, and there's going to be some protectionism, there's not going to be a huge amount of free trade, I think that we are going to see some basic trade networks still exist. And these trade networks all by themselves are going to help maintain the level of civilization that we have. And on top of that, the internet ain't going anywhere. You can't destroy the internet at this point. Unless if you launched EMPs all over the planet, destroying every electronic device, the internet's not going anywhere. We don't need the internet service providers to create it anymore. You can create a local network off your cell phone. So while in the physical world, we're going to like crawl back into our little huts to a certain extent. You're actually going to see meta communities forming online. We're already seeing the early versions of this with forums and message boards where people all show up for something, but there's no strong nationalism with any of them. This time around, you're going to have all these little enclaves, but certain people in the enclaves will belong to a meta enclave, something with an extremely strong ideological purpose to it. And the kids being raised nowadays, the sleeper generation, they're going to be fine. They're going to have a very easy lifestyle when they grow up. So, all of you that bore with me for this hour-long history lecture, thank you, I appreciate it. This is one way that I can see things going. The conflict, which again, I think you can do the math on that, it's going to be extremely bloody. It's going to be very violent. It's going to be pretty goddamn painful. It's also going to be the event that forges the leaders that create the new Pax Catholic, the universal peace. That's the optimistic way I see things going. Because the left, the Puritans, they've got some fight in them still. And they'd be more than happy to create 1984 on Earth. So, this is your error in history. Can't change that. Can't change where you live. Deal with it. Try and make the future better. Aurini out, my brothers.